On today's Locked On Jayhawks, Rylan Griffen, the sharpshooting Alabama transfer, is officially a Jayhawk.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. You can find our show with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. Like and subscribe to the show. Certainly helps us on our end of things. On today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're talking Rylan Griffen, officially a Kansas Jayhawk, how he fits in with the team, because last time we talked about him in a deep dive, that was before AJ Storr committed to KU and before LeBaron Philon asked out of his national letter of intent. So some changes to the K roster. How does he fit in with the team? And is the offseason done or close to being done now for KU? We're going to discuss that on today's episode of the show. First, it is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store and Play Store today, regardless of what your phone situation is. Okay, so this episode of Locked On Jayhawks, as we talked about, if you're an everydayer and tuned into the episode, which was our Football Friday, even though it came out on a Thursday, there's a reason for that. It's because I am currently away for a wedding. So I'm actually recording this ahead of time, which means if I guess this is me talking to the future. I don't know. This episode might never come out, but if it does, that means Rylan Griffen is a Jayhawk. I went ahead and did this ahead of time just in case that it did happen, as there was rumors talking about that he could be announcing on Friday. So if you're listening to this and this is public, that means that Rylan Griffen ended up being a Jayhawk after he was courted by KU from kind of the get-go of his entrance into the transfer portal. There were Alabama fans clamoring that there was poaching, that there was tampering going on from KU. Well, you can eat it because I don't know, maybe that's a little too rude, but I'll say this. There were like Kobe Bryant, Alabama poaching, tampering rumors too, right? And it's just what happens in today's day and age. Regardless of what happened, doesn't matter. Rylan Griffen is now a Jayhawk. He is a 6'6" wing who will be a junior for the 2024 to 2025 season after spending 2 seasons at Alabama. He played 15 minutes a game as a true freshman at Alabama. That was the team that was the number 1 overall seed in the tournament, made the Sweet 16. This most recent season, he averaged over 11 points per game while shooting 45% from the field, 39% from 3 on high volume for a run-and-gun Alabama team that made the Final Four. He played the 2 and the 3 for the Crimson Tide. He was up to over 12 points per game in the NCAA tournament, 48% from 3, including a big overall effort in the North Carolina game where he played really good defense on RJ Davis, though that's not exactly what he was most known for. It was for being a scorer and a three-point shooter. We did that Rylan Griffen deep dive a week ago, so I would still recommend checking that out if you missed it, because it has a lot of good stats and a lot of good info and scouting report on his profile and a lot of good synergy stats. So go back and check that one out. And if you're an everydayer, you already tuned into it. But I will rehash some of those stats here, not all of them, and then I'll actually give you some new stats here as part of this with Griffen being a Jayhawk. So 90th percentile in spot-up shooting, according to Synergy, 40% on spot-up threes, 73rd percentile as a pick-and-roll ball handler. Helps if he's playing the 2, because then you become that other initiator for the offense if you want to give Dajuan a little bit of a breather or something. 96th percentile in handoffs. If you go under a handoff, he will just shoot it in your face, and Kansas likes to run the chop play with handoffs. 84th percentile in catch and shoot. He went 40% on catch and shoot threes. He was 37% on guarded catch and shoot threes and 42% on unguarded catch and shoot threes. Both really good. According to Evan Miyakawa, among 123 players in the SEC last year who played 500 or more possessions, he was 6th in the conference in offensive BPR. So his basically offensive value was top 10 in the conference a season ago offensively. Now, the defense remains some questions here. You look at Synergy, he was only in the 36th percentile on defense a season ago, which would basically make him below average there. And he was only among the 123 qualified SEC players by Evan Miyakawa, 500 plus possessions. He was only 105th there. So those aren't great, but 1 year prior, he was 32nd among the 124 qualified defensively by defensive BPR and Evan Miyakawa's site, and the synergy numbers were much better in year one. So you have one good sample size, but it was him playing a much smaller role. You have one not as good sample size in a bigger role at Alabama. But part of that too could be, a rising tide raises all boats. I don't know. I completely messed up that thing. Whatever it is, it's the opposite because the Alabama defense was really bad. And so you're going to be put in some bad situations. So I don't think we have a full scope of how he is as a defender. Obviously, he did really well in the RJ Davis matchup, but for most of the season, maybe it wasn't great. We'll see what it is at Kansas. If he can just be an average defender, I think you gladly take that. So this is an interesting thing that you can find on CBB Analytics. And you can basically go to a player's profile and you can see how they did statistically at everything. Shooting the basketball, where they shot well from, the different areas, how they did as a passer, turning the ball over, and defensively, and some of the stats, and everything put together. And they have basically you can compare how this player, who are the closest statistic profiles to their full game in the country, in a specific conference or whatever. So I want to do this for him as far as Big 12 comparisons. What are players that he compared to? And none of these are like, oh, he's a 98%, comparison. But like, there's some of these where it's like, oh, he is 85% of his statistic profile is very similar to this player. And so I think this gives you kind of an idea of what you're bringing to the table with some other players in the Big 12 that you might have familiarized yourself with. So here are some of I'm not going to go over all of them, but these are just some of the players who are in his top 10 for statistic profile comps of the Big 12, according to CBB Analytics. The number one was Traven Nell from BYU, who is like one of the best shooters in the conference and in the country. Rivaldo Soares for Oklahoma. He was injured in the second time that the KU played Oklahoma, so maybe you don't recognize him as well, but he was awesome in the Big 12 portion of the season. Langston Love for Baylor. He had that injury for Baylor, which was unfortunate for kind of their tail end of the season, but he was having an unbelievable year. I think at one point he was shooting like 50% from three in Big 12 play. Travion Tennyson from TCU is one of the statistic comps. We saw up close and personal what he did in Allen Fieldhouse and what he could do when he was getting going. And then Max Asmus from Texas was another one who was in the top 10 on this list. So again, it's not a perfect comp, and there are some things that are, ebbs and flows, and obviously it'll be a different style of play for him at Kansas than it was at Alabama, and obviously another year of growth. He should be even better this year, as long as he can adjust to the system and everything. But I don't know. I thought some of those were kind of interesting, and what's the common theme? Because here's the thing. You would have taken any of those players on KU this past season. You're saying, oh, you can add Trayvon Nell or Travion Tennyson or, Max Asmus or Langston Love. Wouldn't that have been kind of perfect for what Kansas was looking for this past season? So I think all those are great. And overall, too, if you do a search query for Big 12 players in the 2023 to 2024 season who averaged at least 11 points per game, shot over 5 3-point attempts per game, and made at least 39% of their threes, Rylan Griffen qualifies for all those. The list in the Big 12 is only 3 guys deep. Darius Johnson at UCF, Jalen Bridges at Baylor, and Kerr Carissa at West Virginia. Griffin would have joined that list. And even if I expanded that search query, because, sometimes I make fun of it too, where it's like, oh, he became the first player to score 10 points with 3 rebounds and exactly 2 steals on 1 of 4 shootings since Bo Rogers in 1935, right? Some of that stuff can be a little silly. So I opened up the search criteria a little bit more. What if we looked at Big 12 players this past season who shot at least 37% from 3? Again, Griffin was over 39%, but at least 37%. On 4 or more attempts per game. Again, Griffin was over 5 attempts per game. And averaged at least 10 points per game. He was over 11 points per game. The only added names you would get on that query on that list would be LJ Cryer at Houston, Javon Small at Oklahoma State, which is slowly becoming another KU target, Simus Lukosius at Cincinnati, Chance McMillan at Texas Tech, and Traven Nell at BYU. So by looking at this, and I don't know, man, you could have just looked at the stats and kind of deciphered this yourself, but I think this was another kind of cool way of looking at it. Ryland Griffen immediately is one of the best shooters in the conference, one of the best shooters in the Power 5 for a team that what do they need? Exactly that. All right, let's continue on how he fits into KU, especially now that AJ Storr is part of the roster for KU on this episode of Locked on Jayhawks. First, this episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the winning formula for championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Kind of like the transfer portal, right? You can bring in speed, you can bring in shooting, you can bring in athleticism. With over 122 million parts, which is also like the transfer portal, for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. That is not like the transfer portal. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that huge win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, how does Rylan Griffen fit into the KU roster? Because when we had the deep dive episode about a week ago, that was without AJ Storr on board yet for KU, and that was without the LeBaron Philon news. Now, the Philon news probably is a little less consequential to all of this because, if anything, this would have just meant less playing time for Philon, probably less the other way. But then again, maybe if Philon would have been like a 10-minute per game guy or 15-minute per game guy, like maybe that means Rylan Griffen plays 24 minutes as opposed to 28 or something, wherever those minutes get allocated elsewhere. But even with AJ Storr aboard, I expect Rylan Griffen to start. Now, I guess hypothetically, if Johnny Furphy came back, maybe it's a better conversation where it's like, okay, I guess here, let's divvy it out this way, because I think AJ Storr could start at the 3 or the 4. The way I view it is this. Dajuan Harris is locked in to start. Dajuan Harris is going to be a starter for KU. Hunter Dickinson, if he returns, is locked in to start. Storr, to me, is locked in to start. Is that going to be at the 3? Is that going to be at the 4? Whatever. But that's 3 starters. I think Rylan Griffen will start, and that just comes from a couple things. 1, I think he's a good basketball player. 2, I think he fits a lot of what Kansas needs. And 3, it's you don't see a guy often go from hey, I was a starter on a Final Four team, and now I'm transferring to a school who is actually, by some metrics, worse than our school this past season, and now I'm not starting, right? That doesn't happen often. Now, again, there will be open competition. Bill Self's not just going to hand them the keys to be the starter, but if I'm guessing, Rylan Griffen will end up being a starter. And then the real competition there becomes, I guess, hypothetically, you could say Griffin versus Elmarko Jackson versus Zeke Mayo versus, I guess, Riley Kugel, although at this point, who knows what's going to kind of happen there. But which you could say, if we're comparing Riley Kugel, for instance, and again, there's some rumors and scuttlebutt about, what's going to happen if they're going to be able to bring him on. He hasn't signed yet, whatever. But hypothetically, you could say, well, 2 years ago, Riley Kugel was the much better player in the same conference than Rylan Griffen. This past year, Griffin was the better player than Kugel, but what does that mean? So, would it be unthinkable if that were to happen in the competition? So those guys would be in competition. There would also be the competition of, are you wanting to start KJ Adams at the 4 or not? Because then that depends. If KJ's starting at the 4, then AJ Storr starting at the 3, and then the 2-guard position is between Griffin and Elmarko and Mayo and Kugel, which I would give the edge there to Griffin personally. Then again, you could also have the discussion of, well, are we going to bring KJ Adams off the bench? And then AJ Storr is going to start at the 4. Rylan Griffin's going to start at the 3, and we'll start Zeke Mayo at the 2, or Riley Kugel at the 2, or Elmarko Jackson at the 2, or something like that, right? Or insert another transfer that you could bring on at one of those other positions. That's entirely possible too. But I see Rylan Griffen, regardless of which machination. To me, the big question, I view it as Dajuan's going to start, Storr's going to start, Rylan Griffin's going to start, Hunter Dickinson, if he's back, is going to start. The competition to me becomes, does KJ start, or do you start another guard with one of those other guys? But KU has a lot of good players, and they have a lot of good competition now, which means that you should have a much better bench than you did a season ago. And we are kind of guilty of this each and every offseason, the idea that, we always talk about the potential of a player, and, this player is going to bring this, and oh my gosh, that guy's going to be so good, and he's coming off the bench. And then a lot of times we get into the season, and that doesn't end up being the case, right? We kind of saw that the last 2 years at Kansas. But it feels a little more certain this time because it feels like you have more real production, more proven college production coming off the bench this go-around than some of those past years where the bench production was freshmen or guys making a jump to their sophomore year that you were expecting a big leap, and it just didn't happen. This one feels more like it's okay, well, if you have Zeke Mayo coming off the bench, I feel pretty good about where that's going to be, right? Or one of these other guys, or bringing in another transfer, whatever it ends up being. But obviously, from Griffin's perspective, he becomes one of KU's top scorers. I think interesting discussion who's going to lead Kansas in scoring next season. I mean, Hunter Dickinson would probably be the prohibitive favorite there, but AJ Storr is going to score a lot. Like Rylan Griffen took a huge jump from freshman to sophomore year and was a great shooter. What if he takes another jump to his junior year and he becomes like Ochai Agbaji at Kansas, where you're just constantly getting him like threes and having him leading the team in scoring? I don't know. Basically, I guess you would say this, like, if Hunter Dickinson's like even odds to lead the team in scoring and AJ Storr's like plus 150, if you're getting Rylan Griffen at like 4-1, I might get in on some of that action, right? Would be kind of the way that I would put that. But I think if he does take that another jump, it's not unthinkable that he ends up being one of the 2 or 3 best players on the team. And heck, maybe Rylan Griffen already is, based on the value he's adding to the team with the shooting. He provides more versatility too. He provides more athleticism. He provides more NBA and ceiling potential. But most of all, it is just that shooting. You needed more shooting, and this guy comes in and does just that at a very high level. He's a better three-point shooter than anything that Kansas had last season, and he is good enough to play big minutes for KU this next season. He makes Dajuan Harris better. He's going to allow him to get more assists and open up the court for him to hopefully finish better around the rim. He makes AJ Storr better because, now AJ Storr might have more driving lanes or more true one-on-ones. He would make Hunter Dickinson better because that's going to allow either for less double teams in the post or more assists for Hunter Dickinson if he gets doubled, because it'll be a more consistent knockdown shot from the outside than the amount of times that Kansas missed wide open threes after Hunter Dickinson or Dajuan Harris passed out of like a double team or out of traffic. It's a huge pickup for KU that would fit any team. Every single team in the country is looking for wings. Every single team in the country is looking for guys who can shoot, because you know what? No matter what, regardless of the role, whether it's a small role off the bench or a big role as one of your top players, every team needs more of those guys. And so this is a huge gift for KU. And on top of all of this, he seems to have a passion for Kansas that it seems like he wanted to go there from the get-go. He has Final Four experience now, and he was on a number 1 overall seed as a freshman. There's a lot to love here. I think now the question just becomes, what does this mean for the rest of the offseason for KU? Because I guess technically Kansas has 13 scholarship players now with Rylan Griffen. If you're counting Johnny Furphy, they have 12 if you're not counting Johnny Furphy, if you're saying he's staying in the NBA. So I guess, therefore, is the offseason done? Let's answer that momentarily on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. Scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low. Not sure you or your team can pull out a win. That's when you dig deep, lift your head up, and say to yourself, time to get back in the game. Pull off some bank heists and take as much of your friends' money as you possibly can. That's right. The smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime, with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. Play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. Make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. Charge other players rent for your iconic properties, just like in classic Monopoly. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play Store today. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. And again, I'm recording this ahead of time, so if it happened, that means that it happened, and that's exciting. I will make note real quick of this Sunday, I believe, is, or maybe it's the Saturday. Yeah, this Sunday. Nope, Saturday. I don't know, whatever. Is the NBA draft early entrant date that you have to put your name into by, like the early deadline. So, which means Hunter Dickinson, we should be knowing by the latest this weekend what he's going to do. So when we decide that or figure that out, we'll have an episode on that early next week. But as far as the offseason goes, Kansas is now sitting with 12 scholarship players, not counting Johnny Furphy, who is retaining his collegiate eligibility, but certainly seems like there is a lean toward him going pro. I remain to be seen that, I don't know, it sounds like a lot of the guys who are much more in the know than me and are experts seem to think that he is going pro, but like everybody thought that with Kevin McCullough too, and it ended up he came back last year. It seemed like that was the way it was going with Ochai Agbaji. He decided to come back. Things change, I guess is the way of putting it. So I'm just leaving my mind open to whatever can happen. But Kansas can play with 12 or 13 scholarship guys, depending how they want to handle the NCAA sanctions. They can either play with 12 this year and 13 the following season, or 13 this upcoming season and 12 the season after that. which after LeBaron Philon departed, they now have that kind of extra one open. Unless you think Furphy can come back, then you would be at the 13 mark. Of course, Johnny Furphy could stay in the draft and you'd have one, and or someone else could leave, which I guess there seems to be a lot of scuttlebutt circling back to the Riley Kugel stuff about if that's going to fall through and if he's not going to actually end up being a Jayhawk. So I guess point being, the way I see it, you do have room for at least one more addition. Whether you do view the Johnny Furphy one as possibly being open, or the Kugel one possibly being open, or somebody else could possibly leave as part of a ripple effect of the Griffin decision. Maybe the Kugel part would be kind of part of that, just kind of circling through and tying things together there. And you just make things work as you go. So I guess the way I would say it, like, it would have been one thing if LeBaron Philon, if that news never came down, then we probably would be waiting to see if there was a ripple effect from Rylan Griffen coming in, that if Rylan Griffen coming in led to anybody leaving. But now that the LeBaron Philon news already happened before the Rylan Griffen news, and maybe they were in conjunction, maybe LeBaron Philon was informed of what was going to happen with Rylan Griffen, and it just, the announcement wasn't public yet. It means KU is not done. And I'd imagine there's going to be plenty more kicking the tires with guys like Kobe Brea, maybe a guy like Javon Small, maybe someone else. Maybe it's not even players in the portal. Maybe it's a player who's entering the draft process and, decides to exit or something. I don't know, but spring bill will continue on, and the offseason is not done quite yet, but this is quite the pickup with Ryland Griffen. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. Hopefully no more breaking news till next week, but we'll be back to talk about it when I do get back in the tune of things. So see you then on the next edition of LOJ.